Hi, have you ever wondered why teachers give you chocolate during class or a possible way to get more chocolate? If so, this is a place where you might find an answer. So what is learning? Scientifically speaking, learning is a long-term change in behavior that is based on experience. Here's an image that shows you a broad sketch of what you will learn in this video. So I will talk about all the parts and give some real-life examples. If you're taking notes, this will be the only slide that you will need them, since other slides are just pictures. Now, going back on trail. Let's first look at associative learning. Associative learning is a way of learning based on new stimuli. In a nutshell, it means our brains were not designed to recall information in isolation. Instead, we group information together into one associative memory. And it has two main conditions, classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning works after repeating exposure to two stimuli occurring in sequence. For example, after the experience of listening to a loud and overwhelming sound of lightning, our response is to cover our ears. Here, our response to thunder becomes associated with the lightning. One major experiment that proves that classical conditioning exists is made by Ivan Pavlov, also known as the dog experiment. Pavlov is able to make a dog drool when it hears the sound of a bell with classical conditioning. Let's look step by step why the dog resulted salivating at the sound of his bell. Before conditioning, the unconditioned stimuli would be the food that is in the dog's mouth, and the unconditioned response would be the salivation. By showing the food and the sound of the bell, the dog makes a connection in those two stimuli. After repeating these processes as a result, the dog will salivate even when the bell rings. Another example of classical conditioning would be the little Albert experiment. The mouse has no effect on little Albert. However, when there's a loud noise, Albert starts to cry. By connecting these two stimuli, when Albert sees a light alone, he starts to cry, which is the conditioned response. We can graph whether the classical conditioning is occurring or not. To divide into sections, acquisition is the association between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. And to see the result, in the extinction part, we see the conditioned response, but this will slowly decrease. And the important part is that even though the response extinguishes, after a set of time, you will see the spontaneous recovery. Now, let's look at the second part of the associative conditioning, the operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a method of learning that occurs through rewards and punishment for a behavior. It divides into reinforcement and punishment, and this is where you might get an answer for teachers giving you chocolate. But first, let's look at one of the operant experiments. B.S. Skinner developed a behavioral technology that teaches mice to press on specific buttons in order. While his experiment, he discovered the law of effect, which states that behavior followed by favorable consequences become more likely, while behavior followed by unfavorable consequences become less likely. So basically, rewarded behavior is more likely to happen again. Reinforcement is feedback from the environment to make it more likely to happen again, and there's a positive and negative side. This doesn't mean good or bad. Positive reinforcement is a response by presenting a pleasurable stimulus, and negative reinforcement strengthens a response by reducing or removing something undesirable or unpleasant. An example of a positive reinforcement is when teachers give you chocolate. One important point that people misunderstand is that negative reinforcement is not punishment. An example of a negative reinforcement is fastening the seat belt to turn off the beeping sound from the car. Once again, negative reinforcement is not punishment. So what is punishment then? Punishment is a feedback that makes a stimulus more unlikely to happen again. As well as reinforcement, punishment also has a negative and positive side. Just think that negative is taking away and positive is giving. Let's look at some examples. So an example of a positive punishment could be a parent giving a child spanking, or even a parking ticket is a positive punishment. A negative punishment is revoking the driver's license, or a parent taking away the children's privileges of going out or playing games. By this slide, you should understand what is operant and classical conditioning. If someone is learning association between its behavior and the resulting event, it is operant conditioning. And if a person is learning association between events that it does not control, it's classical conditioning. Now let's look at observational learning. Not like associative learning, observational learning is very straightforward. It's learning by observing others' behavior. Learning by observation includes mirroring and imitating, and there are factors that influence learning, such as biological, psychological, and socio-cultural influence. Let's take a look at observational learning experiment, the boo-boo doll experiment. This experiment proves that people learn from what they watch by showing a child violence and leaving the doll with the child in a separate room. The results were that children who watched the violence beforehand showed more violence than children who did not have violence before. This experiment is also called the mirroring experiment. When we watch others doing something or feeling something, neurons fire a pattern that would fire as if we are in action or having the feeling ourselves, which is called mirroring effect. It is the same with our emotion. When we see someone in pain, our brain shows neurons firing from the pain side, which we call having empathy. As we are born with a mirroring brain, we tend to imitate people around us, and this is seen since we are young. This includes even over-imitating, that is, copying adults' behavior that has no function or no reward. To conclude, there are so many varieties of learning, but the main learning that you need to know for psychology are associative learning and observational learning. Thank you.